For all of you, the many thousands of you joining us online, please do not forget to ask your questions directly, and we will try and take as many of them as we can, and also for the audience. But before we start, and David Gellis, our business correspondent, comes on stage with the panel, I'd like to thank Siemens Energy for their support of this session, indeed the entire series on the energy transition. And I'd just like to play a very short video. Thank you.
Saying the New York Times is turning into a movie producing company.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all so much for being here. What it takes, responsibilities and incentives, is really sort of at the core of so many of the discussions that everyone is gathered in Glasgow for these 2 weeks for. I'm pleased to have a terrific panel that will help us unpack some of the real specifics. Because, of course, for years now, policymakers, businesses have been making pledges, but I think there's a sense in the air that it's time to really start acting on some of these. And we're starting to see, perhaps, movement in the right direction. So I'm pleased to have with us, to my immediate right, Henry Fernandez, the chairman and CEO of MSCI, a provider of indices, data, and so much more, and a really essential part of the movement to make the financial community, the public markets, much more attuned to ESG and sustainability. To Henry's right is Andreas Ahrens, the head of climate for IKEA Group, one of the people that has helped create this extraordinary space that we're in, and IKEA also clearly a leader. And somewhere, here we go, Jada, do we have you?
Yes, you do.
Terrific. Jada McKenna is CEO of Mercy Corps, calling in from Washington, D.C., and Jada helps lead a true army of responders who are on the front lines, helping people adapt to climate crises all around the world. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to get started and ask Henry just to give us a bit of perspective, because Henry, perhaps more than anyone on this panel, you sit truly at the intersection of the policy and the business sides, and those two conversations this year are perhaps coming together like never before. What is your sense, both of where the policy discussion is at this, maybe halfway mark in in COP, and also where the business side is.
So Paris was about the why we need to do this. And Glasgow was meant to be how we start doing it. And I am being surprisingly pleased with what we've been able to achieve here in Glasgow in the how. Think of it as a glass, obviously. The glass is a little bit full, a little bit, not a lot full, but a little bit full. So the feeling here in Glasgow has been that we filled it up a little bit. We have a long way to go, but many sectors of our society and our global economy are already getting going in the right direction. So instead of focusing on the enormity of the task of how much we need to fill, in the glass, people are focused on building momentum, on continuing to fill it one step at a time.
Yeah.
So we have seen pronouncements from obviously governments and countries about net zero pledges. So we can focus on the countries that haven't, right? Or the focus that are way too far out. But there is a large number of countries that are already focused on their net zero pledges and many more coming. And I think there is momentum building. Yeah. And like anything in life, there is leaders, there is middle of the pack, and there is laggers. The area that I'm focused on the most is capital. Yeah. And this is the COP that was devoted, part of it, to the capital markets, to finance. We need capital. Any reconstruction of the global economy throughout history requires capital. So we've achieved a great deal, in the capital track.
Absolutely.
Of this COP26.
And I want to talk about that in depth in just a few more minutes. Andreas, in the green room, we were talking about the fact that it seems like, whereas 5 and 10 and 15 years ago, perhaps, you had governments sort of reaching very far and the business community not quite willing to go and catch up with them. It almost seems like it's reversed at this point. We have businesses actually moving, you could argue, faster than many governments around the world. To what do you attribute this reversal in momentum and the leading role, frankly, that the business community seems to be taking now?
Now, I don't know exactly why I would say business are in the lead over countries, but I would say at least that there's an increased, but I recognize that we business are part of a problem and then also part of the solution. And I think also as more and more companies are committing to net zero and that we're cutting emissions by half by 2030, this creates an awareness among other companies as well. And also, this is a gigantic challenge that we have ahead of us with climate change, so we cannot do it alone either. So I think that type of partnership, which is also increasing more and more, I think is also creating like rings on the water as well. Yeah. And I think also we're feeling the pressure from customers as well. We're feeling pressure from also legislation if we take the European Green Deal as well. So I would say either you are a front runner and you're proactive, or you'll be reactive based on the coming legislation. So you need to stay ahead. But the basis, it's our responsibility to take action right here, right now.
You talked about that responsibility. I mean, I hope another thing that is sort of putting a fire under everyone's seat is the really devastating effects of climate change that I think are becoming more and more apparent every single week, it seems, especially this year. Jada, can you give us sort of a visceral sense of some of the work you've been doing and where you are seeing most clearly the true effects of climate change, particularly, I have to believe, in more vulnerable communities in the global south? Why is it so important that businesses, policymakers act not in 2050 or 2070, but immediately? So you frankly just don't have so much work to do.
Exactly. The biggest threat to climate change and us successfully navigating through this is poverty. And so I hope that we are able to have a conversation in Glasgow and beyond about what I'm calling the and. So it's too late to be focusing only on emissions. We have to focus critically on adaptation. Climate change is already here, and it's a threat multiplier to communities facing poverty. It's increasing hunger. It's increasing poverty. It's leading to increases in conflict. And those are all things that are a drag on our own economic growth as a world population, and also just threatens our security everywhere. So we are seeing people navigating through poor harvest and through water insecurity and doing it doing it in different ways. And so the and is we really want the private sector and everyone to think about emissions and funding for adaptation. And the second part of the and is the private sector is a critical partner on the emission side, but also on the adaptation side. And the communities that are suffering the most from climate change are the ones who are contributing the least to emissions. And there has been a dearth of investment in climate solutions and investments and ventures that address climate things or encourage climate smart practices in the countries where we work, particularly the fragile countries. Only 1% of private funding is going to fragile countries like Sudan or Yemen and Afghanistan, and those are mostly natural resource-based populations. And so we really we need to come together globally in all ways.
Yeah, thank you so much for that essential context. And I think it just puts in perspective the enormity of the challenge. It's one thing for companies to talk about reducing their own emissions, but really figuring out ways to systemically address what's going to need to be the reorchestrating of whole economies, especially in the global south, that don't have the infrastructure even for clean energy at this point. And I was talking to someone last night who talked about a city he visited in India where roughly 2 million people were either participating or dependent on the coal economy. And thinking about how we transition cities, whole industries, economies like that into a net zero future, I think just the tip of the iceberg as we think about this. Henry, you talked about capital and the importance of capital, and you could argue that word is essential to each of the tasks, each of the challenges that we've already referenced. When you look at where we are today and the beginning of movements, and we've seen commitments from the Net Zero Banking Alliance, from Mark Carney's group, just in the last few days, we've seen the divestment movement is gaining steam. Henry was quoted in an article I have in today's paper about this. What are the most effective ways to start redirecting capital away from legacy energy systems and towards truly net zero solutions, towards the solutions that are going to, again, fix not just one company's emissions targets, but truly start repairing some of these communities in the global south as well?
So there is a coming massive reallocation of capital and repricing of assets in the world. And most people think that is 20, 30 years from now. We all know that markets are discounting mechanisms. So that's coming. It's already happening, and it's coming in the next few years, not in the next few decades. So that reallocation of capital is going to require a significant amount of transparency and data, for example, to understand who's a carbonizing company and by how much, who is not a carbonizing company and by how much, and what are their trajectory in terms of pledges and detailed plans that they have made. So I think that we can make the capital markets of the world work very well and effectively to create the incentives. You talk about responsibilities and incentives. I think the capital markets and the players in the capital markets realize their responsibility, a lot of it because of self-interest. If they are holding a portfolio of investments that are highly carbonizing, they're not going to do well. Those portfolios are not going to be, good returns. So therefore, they have a strong incentive to start moving into areas of the investment landscape that are going to be survivors, right, and less carbonizing. But what we need are the mechanisms to feed into the markets for them to understand. We need the tools, we need the data, we need the models to feed into that so that they have transparency, they have the navigational tools, if you think about it that way, to be able to reallocate capital effectively. And that's what we've achieved here. There's been pronouncements about mandatory disclosures of public and private companies about their carbon emissions. You have $130 trillion of capital already committed to net zero pledges. That's moved very fast this year. So we already have the capital mobilizing. We have the companies already becoming aware that their consumers, their employees, their capital providers are demanding this change. What we now need to do is get the markets, the market forces, the market mechanisms to work hard in reallocating that capital with transparency, with information, with tools, with data.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the specific push and pull about allocating capital towards companies that are still serious polluters, still big parts of the problem a bit later. But first, Andreas, IKEA is a private company. It's privately held, so you're not subject to some of these same public pressures. So you don't have necessarily the same set of incentives. And yet, without giving too much credit to the company, I can't be too credulous as a cynical New York Times journalist. We try to hold people's feet to the fire. It's also true that IKEA has gone further than many companies of its own volition well before many companies did. Setting aside the supply chain, because I want to talk about that later, setting aside the supply chain, what were the levers that you were able to do, that you were able to use and pull that allowed the company to transition away from carbon-intensive energy sources fast? Where are the lessons that other companies can learn from and look to IKEA and say, they were able to do this, maybe we can too?
No, as a starting point, of course, it's nice to be recognized as a leader, but as our founding father Ingvar said, just because you're best doesn't mean you're good. So within IKEA, we always say that most things remain to be done. And as I say, we're a private-owned company. We have a very long-term agenda, whilst other companies are aiming for quarterly reports. We have a minimum, maybe a yearly report, but we have a more, I'd say, a long-term agenda.
Yeah.
I think it's also connected to the people. I mean, we are a value-based company, so we recruit people to the company based on their values, and I think it creates a type of atmosphere, an entrepreneurial spirit, which really drives this agenda. And when we set up to revise our climate agenda as part of the Paris Agreement, we revisited the entire climate footprint of IKEA, asking ourselves, could we even reduce our emissions in absolute terms while growing the company as much as we wanted to? So we worked hard together with different parts of the business. We met product developers, people in purchasing, people in stores, asking them, like, this is how our footprint looks like. What solutions do you know? So we really engaged people all over the company. It wasn't just that top management. And I think that helped us to really have many of the facts in place, both the solutions we know today, but also what are the gaps today. And then that, based on that strong commitment we had on many different layers in the company, as well as our board, I think that was a key part of actually getting our climate agenda forward, and not just committing to the goals and our footprint, but then also how do we actually steer our business towards actually taking those actions, enabling that we don't just have set goals, but making concrete, like making, for instance, the plant ball. We sell meatballs, maybe you've heard. And a key part was also addressing those holy icons and making those plant-based. When we started, I heard, don't touch the meatball. And then the management team of food said, well, we won't approve your climate goal unless we get a plant-based meatball. And that was also decisions taking deep down in the organization. And I think that's key. It doesn't just sit with the top management. You need to enable and make climate concrete across so many parts. And then, of course, you need that long-term buy-in so you can take that. But it's about engaging people, because I don't develop products, product developers do. I don't purchase products, purchasers do. And the people who meet you in the stores, those are leading the climate agenda in the stores. So
I mean, I write about companies every single day for the New York Times, and I know when I come across sort of a unique or distinguished culture, and even the sort of bottom-up leadership that you're describing is frankly, I think Henry would probably agree, pretty foreign to a lot of multinationals that you would find listed on the stock exchanges. So we should talk more, if we have time. I'm adding a long list to our agenda here, about the differences between a public and private, and where you can really find those incentives. But Jada, first, one theme that has come up every single day of COP this week is the massive amount of capital, as Henry said, that is needed, but also the recognition that if we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year or trillions and trillions of dollars over the next decade, that's not all going to come from public sources. There needs to be a real allocation of private capital to fund climate resilience. And Jada, this is something you've thought about from a bunch of different roles that you've held over the course of your career. And I wonder, from your perspective, what are some of the most effective strategies for incentivizing private companies, which is to say, which is to say public companies, but companies, to get private capital actually deployed towards these climate resilient solutions that, again, can benefit most the communities you're dealing with every day?
We have seen a lot of support and help with this in partnerships. Obviously, private companies need to make returns, and these are longer term investments for them in the types of environments we work in. And so we are calling on companies to partner with organizations like us, and we are calling on public sector actors to help subsidize the cost of these partnerships. So, for example, the British government has subsidized a partnership that we have with Equity Bank, which is a regional financial institution based out of Kenya, where we are providing technical support to them to create loans for agriculture, for small farmers, and loans particularly to help them adapt climate smart practices. And so we're helping them with the technical parts, but they also have a guarantee funded by the British government to enter that and to explore this new line of products that ultimately is doing very well and something they may want to expand. We're also encouraging people to invest in ventures. We were one of the first organizations in our sector to develop a venture fund, and using small venture amounts like 100,000, things that would fall below the threshold of some of the biggers. We are investing in companies that provide climate insurance and flood insurance. And companies that provide products for weather predictions for farmers. So there are a lot of things happening in these local economies where climate is hitting them very hard, and we need more incentives for private sector partners to partner with us and governments and others to really bring commercial solutions to these marketplaces. We are also great environments to test products in these markets, create new markets. So it will be a win-win long term.
Yeah, I mean, and it's extraordinary. Again, I'm just thinking about the work I do and some of the stories I write. How few partnerships like that, of that sort, that I find myself writing about. I mean, I get pitched every day. I can't tell you what my inbox looks like, but all your PR people, they flood my inbox every day. But I don't get enough pitches like that. You send me some pitches like that, you'll have my attention.
Okay.
Careful what I wish for. Henry, let's talk more about the market. And you have several times argued that the market is starting to price in climate risk. And I wonder if you can first talk about what that looks like. Do you really believe that the public markets are starting to price in the risk of climate, stranded assets, these sort of things? And then I've got a follow-up. But first, give us your top-line view of where we are in this journey towards the public markets, really trying to understand the risk of especially fossil fuel companies.
Right. So first of all, before that, just one thing that we've been talking quite a lot about at MSCI is the world is looking at this problem from a risk and cost perspective. I have to do this. It's a problem. It's a headache and all of that. We gotta flip that narrative.
Yeah.
The opportunities are immense in this, and it is a lot easier to mobilize humanity for opportunities than it is to have to do something because of just risk. So we can talk about that later. But if you just see in the last 18 months, one example of how things are getting priced is ESG in general, environmental, social governance in general, which has a component, which is climate, environmental, but it has other components, obviously social issues and governance issues. The outperformance of companies in the last 18 months that are very focused on ESG is far greater than the companies that are not. So that tells you already how the market is already pricing, ESG in general. Now, what we now need to do is to break out climate threat, climate problems and opportunities from the ESG. People talk it sometimes interchangeably because climate will swamp ESG, basically. So we're beginning to see, obviously, capital moving away from oil and gas companies. There are a lot of investors. We work with the University of California Investment Office. They manage the pension fund of all the people in the University of California. They manage the endowment. It's about $100 billion.
Yep.
And we develop an index for them for fossil fuel-free investment. So they divested of all their fossil investment and switched that money to renewable energy. Now, that's $100 billion that already made an allocation to move away from fossil fuels into renewable energy and clean technology and the like. So that's a concrete example of a pool of money that has done that. So you're already beginning to see the differences in prices. Green bonds versus normal bonds, the differences are 5-10 basis points today. Those differences were zero a couple of years ago. That difference will continue to expand.
Yeah. Briefly, I want to follow up here, because in the story that, again, just is in today's paper, I picked up on the claims that some senior finance executives have made over the last couple weeks. And this started when Steve Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone in Saudi Arabia last week, essentially alleged that pressure from ESG investment, the divestment movement, was having a near-term effect on sending energy prices higher. Now, that was sort of a compelling argument. So we went around and I talked to Jamie Dimon, I talked to Larry Fink at Blackstone, and each of them said at some level, yes, we're starting to see capital move away from traditional oil and gas companies, and that in the aggregate, that could start to put pressure. But in addition, they also flagged another real concern, which was this. They said, listen, if all that money floods away from we've got decades more where we're going to be reliant on this. And if we take those assets out of the public markets and put them into the hands of private equity or into state-owned entities, it's going to be harder to monitor them, harder to have transparency, harder to have accountability, and the emissions may actually grow worse. So how do we have a clear-eyed view about the transition and not get swept away with starting to pull as much money as we can away from oil and gas companies at a point when many would argue that still plays a very important role in creating a stable global energy system?
The world is faced with a giant balancing act.
Yeah.
Which in my mind is made up of the three E's: economic prosperity, energy abundance or energy availability, and environmental sustainability. If the world says we only gonna care about environmental sustainability in the short to medium term, we're gonna kill economic growth and prosperity. We're gonna throw billions of people into poverty. We won't have growth in the world. It's gonna be a pretty bad world. Now, long term, if we don't solve these problems, that's what will need to happen. But in the short term, we need a balancing act. So yes, on one hand, the answer is the pressure that the oil and gas companies are under is going to make them make less investments in oil and gas exploration and creating new fields and all of that, for sure. So some of that may have to move to the private sector, and then we have to catch the private sources of capital.
Yeah.
We need to do that. But on the other hand, to say that in a very short period of time, because of the pressures on ESG and fossil fuel divestment and the like, have already had massive effects, and oil prices are zooming up because of that in a period of months, or quarters. That's not realistic.
Right.
Investments in oil and gas are 10 years out investments, 20 years out investments. So I don't think that's a good excuse, to do. Long term, it will be if we completely deprive the oil and gas industry from any kind of development in oil fields and gas and all of that, and we don't find a substitute. It's going to be pretty bad, for the world. So the balancing act is, how do we invest heavily in renewable energy and clean technology at the same time that we need to continue to live off oil, gas, and some countries even a little bit of coal?
Yeah, it's the great balancing act, as you said. Andreas, let's talk about the supply chain, because as one of the world's largest retailers, you use an enormous amount of raw materials from all around the globe. You have suppliers all over the place. You also have a huge amount of leverage. How are you able to use your leverage as such a large consumer, as such a large buyer, sourcer, to shift behaviors of some of your suppliers?
Yeah.
And is this something that you're seeing other major companies do as well?
I'll say our leverage or influence, you could say, in our supply chain, I would say it varies on which part of our supply chain we're talking about. If we talk about the manufacturing of IKEA products, we usually have a rather high production share of our suppliers' operations. And we work in a very, like partners. We actually don't call them suppliers, we call them supply partners. And here we are developing with our suppliers roadmaps of how they are going to reach our goal to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2030 already. And by that, we identify what are the known activities they have and what are the challenges they have. And together, we work on, is it competence that they need? Is it awareness of technology? Is it financing, etc.? Or are there solutions that we should do as a company? So for instance, one example is that we're providing discounted loans to finance on-site installations in renewable energy, such as solar panels, but also boilers and electrifications of glass furnaces. The second one is that we also found our suppliers had a really difficult time to access renewable electricity. They couldn't buy it from a grid because you can only generate 15% of electricity on-site. So where do you get the remaining 85 from? And what we found that they're too small. They're small, medium-sized enterprises. Power purchase agreements is not applicable to them. Power companies think they're too small or maybe having a credit rating, which is maybe not in line. So what we've done is we consolidate. We're starting to consolidate electricity consumption of our suppliers. And that electricity consumption, it's to such a high, big amount that we actually are above thresholds. And we, as a company, can also go in with our credit rating to negotiate framework agreements, which then our suppliers can connect into, so that they actually purchase renewable electricity for our entire factory. So I think you need to find a partnership and then new ways of doing business. Now that was manufacturing. When it comes to transports, we are a rather small player. Take ocean shipping. We have a lot of ocean shipping, but we're also a small player. 3 years ago, it felt like we wanted to push towards renewable fuels and zero-emission fuels, but there was no push from or pull from our side. And I think we've just seen, like in the 3 years since Katowice, which was my first COP, there's a change. So instead of having a supplier-purchaser relationship, we are now like partnering, say, with Maersk, like saying, how can we work together? They want zero-emission vehicles and vessels, and we want to get zero-emission vessels as well. So that's why we also launched with COSEB emission, that we jointly have an ambition towards zero-emission fleets. So we push from two different ways. But of course, we're both two small players, but overall, we can send those signals to actually drive it.
Right.
And in a similar way also for material agenda. We need to partner with hard-to-abate sectors such as the steel industry and plastics, where we're small players to actually get those renewable and recycled materials that we're after.
Absolutely. We're starting to see so much more of that coalition building. We're going to go to questions in about 5 minutes, and so I really encourage some of our audience members here. I hope you really will raise your hands when the time comes in about 5 minutes. Jada, first though, some real talk about the role that multinational corporations play in the developing world, in the global south. Many of them have operations there. Many of them look there for cheaper labor than they will find in the West. Many of them have factories, some of which are enormous emitters and polluters. To what extent do you believe, on balance, the business community is meeting its responsibilities to those communities in the global south, in the developing world, where it is working? And if they are not doing enough, what more would you like to see them do in the near term to start taking emissions, climate change more seriously for those communities where they derive so much value?
We need deeper engagement from multinational corporations in these environments. As you rightly pointed out, a lot of these countries are suppliers, they're factories, they're employers, and we need them to engage more deeply into the community. So that means, working with local governments or country governments on their adaptation plans and understanding what those look like, working with their employees on climate smart things, making investments in those communities opportunities into those local communities or other entrepreneurs who are facilitating adaptation and climate emissions, and then obviously doing their part to reduce the emissions of their operations and being responsible local actors, but to engage more deeply in the complete lives of those. It's important for their business and for the sustainability of doing business in those communities, and they just need to be aware that climate is a threat multiplier for every other plague facing that community. And so by doing nothing, they are undermining their own investments.
Can you point to one example of a company that maybe has gotten it right, that has stepped up and started to put the resources where they need to be to take, as good care of their employees in the developing world, in the global south, as they do of, say, their bottom line on Wall Street?
Yeah, so some of the I think there are ways for people to address both, and especially when they look at their customers as well. So some of the agricultural companies, there's a product that we are supporting that is a micro insurance product for small farmers. And some of those companies are pricing them into the cost of the inputs or subsidizing the cost of the insurance for the farmers to then buy the inputs that are needed. So I think there are a lot of win-win things that can be done that are all about partnerships with other types of entities to pull it off. And that's it. They're there.
Okay. Henry, back to the public markets. You made I still find it surprising when I hear it, but I'm starting to believe it, the point that ESG funds and ESG companies are starting to really outperform ones that place less of a focus on that. I think that's great and a first step in the right direction. I guess my question, as we think about the whole universe of public companies out there, is beyond those market pressures, what are the other signals? I mean, beyond the hope that moving in ESG is actually going to maybe let you outperform over the next few years, what are the other signals that policymakers, that industry coalitions, who else can send signals besides, like ESG fund performance that might tell the boards, the directors, the executives at these companies that it's time for them, even if they don't think of themselves as an ESG company, to start taking these things seriously?
Well, it starts with data, information, transparency. So, and we started with that. If you look at our broadest, the largest index that we have, it's got almost 10,000 publicly traded companies, 99% market capitalization of the world, developed, emerging, large cap, mid cap, small caps, everything. That index, if you aggregate all the carbon emissions of every single one of those companies, is 11 gigatons, 11 billion metric tons of carbon emission. We created a model to try to project by 2050 at the current pace of growth and everything, where would those emissions be? 17 billion metric tons. We're going in the opposite direction, from 11 to 17, not from 11 to 5. So then we took each one of those companies and made a public statement of each. So if you're a board, let's say Coal India, right? If you're a board of Aramco or Gazprom, and you say, it's in the public domain that we create, in the case of Coal India Limited, 1 billion metric tons of carbon emissions, and the whole world knows about that, you start getting a lot of pressure from shareholders, from consumers, from employees, and they're like, so it starts with that. So secondly, you got to put all of this in the disclosure requirements so that it's like a newspaper, it's like a media. You magnify the voice. Yeah. So that is the IFRI, the accounting standards. They already are incorporating climate disclosures in addition to the financials and business disclosure. So it's now in the public domain. So I think that's going to put a lot of pressure. So investors are going to start saying, why are you carbonizing so much? We couldn't believe that you were doing this. What are you doing about it? Those are the incentives. Those are the market forces that will force boards and management to start looking at that. But if you have an obscure world without any transparency, any information, any data, it's going to be hard, right? Yeah. And that's the first major step. And then let the forces of the market then take care of the pressure points.
Yeah, Terrific. I think we have mic runners. Let's see those hands start going up. Who's got a question? Right here. Yeah, please.
Hi, thanks. My name is Aiden. I'm a partner at a VC fund, almost $3 billion under management called Eclipse, based in Palo Alto, California. Questions for Andreas. I think we're hearing some great updates about IFRI and how companies are going to be held accountable for carbon emissions. I'm curious what tools exist or how IKEA has approached getting high-quality data from a carbon accounting perspective, not only for scope 1 and 2, but also for scope 3, which you were alluding to earlier about your supply chain. Thank you.
No, definitely. And I think it depends on where in the value chain it is. So for us, I mean, we overall at IKEA, we take the full value chain responsibility, so all scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, not excluding anything. And I think it also depends on where in the supply chain it is. When it comes to our direct suppliers, they actually enter their invoices. So how much liters of fuel, how many cubic meters natural gas, electricity, where does it come from? And then using emission factors, we can then quantify the whole climate footprint. And that's rather accurate. Same as also, I would say, when it comes to our use at home of our LED bulbs and so on. We know exactly how much kilowatt hours each light bulb will run. It's an estimation, but we at least include the full life cycle of a light bulb, so it's a bit overestimation. And we know the electricity footprint of the markets that were bought. But of course, as you go deeper and deeper in your supply chain, the traceability becomes, I would say, for all companies, a bit of an issue. Mm-hmm. And you rely more and more on life cycle assessments, industry standards, sector averages, and so on as well. And here I think it's key to do it in step-by steps. First of all, you need to be as granular as possible. So you need to know not just, oh, is it plastic, but which type of plastic, what's recycled share, which country is it in. And you might need to rely both on scientific LCAs, but you also need to do your own modeling, so you actually can adapt existing emission factors to be more accurate. But of course, we need, first of all, to maybe have that partnership with hard-to-abate sectors that they start sharing more accurately what they are having. And I think that's also leading to transparency in the supply chain. I think we're not really there yet, but hopefully, as companies are taking more and more actions, that data will also be more available, because the key is it needs to be specific and not just industry average, because otherwise we at IKEA, we won't even see the movements we're taking. So if we're moving from virgin plastic to recycled, then we won't maybe see that shift, or we start sourcing from one country to another. So we need to also be able to capture those movements.
Yeah, even for a company like IKEA, a lot of work to do. Another question from the audience, please. Yeah, we've got one just next.
Hello, my name is Sala. I'm also a partner at Eclipse, so I'll spare you guys the intro on that. But actually, continuation of our question, we're pretty focused on this. I was wondering if you guys actually use any tools that are either external to you to actually do that measuring. Is it all internal and you guys are coming up with the processes yourself? Because as you say, if we go by industry averages, it won't actually show micro movements within an organization, but also if we trust every organization to do it themselves without any sort of kind of technological assistance, it's probably going to be ripe with issues. I'm curious if you guys have found external levers that you can use to actually measure your footprint.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that, but also, I mean, Henry, you may have a view on this as well. So Andreas, first, please. First
of all, I would say for each part of value chain, there's a specific model. I mean, for production, there's one. Transport, it's a separate model. Materials, it's using emission factors, and it's a plenitude of databases out there. And also, we rely, but they improve. Some, it's also business information to, say, quantify the electricity consumption of a light bulb. We have that information internally. So I wouldn't say there's one tool which solves it all, but rather you as a company to define at what type of data granularity do you need to be able to identify the actions you want to take, as well as also see the movements you are taking as well, and then find out what solutions are there. And I think depending on your business, there will be different models needed.
Yeah, Henry, I mean, you live and breathe this data every day. What do you see?
So we estimate carbon emission of 25,000 companies, 10,000 publicly traded or listed, and 15,000 private equity venture capital owned companies. And it's not because the company is giving us the information. What we do is we have a series of inputs into models. If you think about this, if you get the revenues of the company, how many employees they have, where are their location through geospatial, their facilities, geospatial, geospatial data and the like, and what type of business activity they conduct. They're mining, bauxite, or are they, processing food and the like. So you go through a lot of inputs. You get within certain degree of comfort of the emissions of that company. The revenues obviously gives you the size and the magnitude. So you can estimate quite a lot. Now, are you going to be 100% right? No, you may be off by 10% or 15%, 12%, but it's good enough to give you a very strong direction of where or those companies are currently and they're headed. So the enemy of a lot of what we do is people are looking for perfect plans. They're looking for very accurate information. And it is, first of all, is irrelevant right now. It's the direction that matters. And secondly, you can estimate a lot of this, with this kinds of data that we collect and these models that we have. And then obviously over time, as the companies disclose and we modify our data, we modify our models, we're going to get maybe 2% off or 5% off.
Yeah.
But right now it's good enough.
Yeah, thank you. Another question in the back. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Julia Osterman. I lead
Julia.
business development at NCX. We're a forest carbon marketplace. And apologies if you spoke about this already at the beginning, but I'm curious about the role of carbon offsets in the transition away from fossil fuels. How do you view that in terms of investment or as a company transitioning to net zero? Thanks.
Yeah, we haven't talked about it. I know IKEA has a view on this. Let's hear it.
Yeah, so our goal is to become climate positive by reducing more greenhouse gas emissions than the IKEA value while growing the IKEA business and not using carbon offsets. The key here is that we really need to take responsibility and act on the root causes, that is our impact on climate change. That not necessarily doesn't mean that we don't invest in restoration, regeneration projects. Those are critical for resilience building as well, but it cannot be a discount to the impact you have on climate.
Yeah. How do you think about carbon offsets when you think about the universe of ESG companies? Because as we know, it's all too easy for someone to buy some carbon offsets while they're still just doing all the wrong things.
Yeah, so there is no question that, we cannot let ourselves off the hook, that we need to decarbonize. And we can't simply just say, okay, somebody else will, so I'll buy it. I'll buy the decarbonation credits from somebody else. So that's not a problem. That's a problem. And therefore, in the investment industry is not a good word when you go talk about offset. Having said that, there are certain industries that are absolutely necessary for society. Airplanes is an example in which we don't have yet electric airplanes.
Right.
And if you do, I'm not going to get on one yet, right? But the point is that, but we need airplanes to fly around. So yes, there could be better fuel that are less carbonizing, but the airlines will have to buy credits in order to get to net zero in the short term because the technology is not there yet. So there are examples where you can do that.
We've got 1 minute left, and I'm going to take moderator's privilege to ask Jada the last question here. We're here in Glasgow, and you've still got people on the ground all over the world right now dealing with real crises as we enjoy one another's company and some nice vegetarian food here. What's the number one thing that the business community could do in the next few years, before the next COP, that would most benefit some of the communities your teams are serving every single day?
Pay attention to the countries that are being left behind, those who are beset by conflict or where there is extreme poverty. There are still opportunities in those marketplaces. There are businesses to invest in there, and there are communities trying to stay and thrive in those places. So don't leave those particularly conflict-affected communities behind. Partner with others and figure out how you can help to make a future there.
Well, that is our collective responsibility, and we should need no incentive to do that good work. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Have a good afternoon.